Okay.
All right. And I need to get a gallery view. Aha. Good afternoon, Ron Maltais. How are you doing?
Hi. Great to see you. I'm fine. And you?
I'm doing well. It's wonderful to have you here on this interview. Ron, I met almost a year and a half ago through music. Ron is a pianist, a composer, a vocalist, um, a man with a big heart and very creative in everything that he does. And I've been having the opportunity of studying voice with Ron. So, Ron, I wondered if you could just tell me a little bit about your background and how music has become your life, how you got into music, and a little bit of some of your, accomplishments as well. So, like a little bio, maybe a little intro there.
Okay. Well, I started playing piano when I was 4 years old by ear, and I had four brothers and a sister, and I was kind of in the middle. And they were terribly annoyed because I figured out how to play all of their music without lessons. So, I guess I don't know. But, it was the only way I could learn because I wasn't allowed to have music lessons until I was 8 years old. So by the time I got to a teacher, my father brought me to this wonderful guy we clicked right away. We had such a good time together. And my father said, oh, well, my son already plays. And this guy was kind of, what? And I sat down and played this little concert, like 10 pieces, all from memory. And, I was just in my element. And I was the most introverted kid. So my voice was coming out through the piano. It was not, I was scared of my own shadow and just could hardly talk, but when I played, this big sound came out of the piano. It was kind of alarming to some people. They thought, is that coming out of you? They couldn't believe it. And then all the way through elementary school, I was kind of an average student. I didn't like school very much. And I was daydreaming all the time and was always imagining being somewhere else or looking out the windows because I loved the trees and, watching the birds. And then whenever I was called on, it took me a moment to snap out of that. But anyway.
Well, let me interject for a second, Ron. And there you are. Yeah. There you have your grand piano in this beautiful room, a whole bank of windows that looks out onto a treed meadow full of birds with a fountain. It sounds like you recreated your perfect environment.
Exactly. I don't think that that's an accident.
No.
When I saw this house, I thought, this has got to be it. Mm-hmm. And then I found out that the person who built my house was an architect, and he built this enormous room because he was a musician and he had a grand piano.
Oh, wow.
So I thought, well, I better buy this house because I think musicians have to live here, So it all worked out beautifully. But when I was a teenager, I finally, in my second year of high school, connected with other musicians for the first time. And all of a sudden, I was a lot happier and I became more extroverted because I found my people, kind of, they understood me and I understood them. And then all of a sudden, all of my grades and all of my subjects went up to straight A's. And then I went to college I went to a music conservatory, and, you know, I just finally started playing with other musicians and went to concerts almost every day.
Wow.
And I was interested in all the arts. I mean, I was living in Boston, so I would go to the ballet, and I would go to this, you know, hear this symphony. I was right around the corner from Symphony Hall. And then when I started singing in choruses, it was at the conservatory. And we sometimes got to perform with the Boston Symphony, because this chorus was very well coached. And, you know, suddenly I'm on the stage at Symphony Hall with a professional orchestra in a wonderful chorus under really notable conductors. And it was a life-changing experience. I mean, I just, and also I was developing as a composer, because I had always improvised as a child at the keyboard. And then, you know, I started seeing from the inside, you know, how things all worked. And I started composing more. And with all the music theory and all the training that I've had, you know, I was able to write scores. And so, you know, that was always kind of a secret hidden thing for me. For a long time, I would introduce myself as a concert pianist, and then later as a singer. And composer was always something that I mentioned a bit later on. And I struggled with that, because for many years I thought, well, I better just choose one thing, because this is ridiculous. How can you do all these things, these musical things? And sadly, or maybe happily, I never actually dropped any of them. I continued to do them all. So I guess that's how it's going to be, you know, forever. And I'm not complaining. You know, right now I'm composing a string quartet, and I'm writing a flute piece for a wonderful player that I know. And, you know, they're both commissions, so I can't back out. I got to do them. I got to get to my desk and make sure they're done before too much longer. So, you know, it's nice to have those little deadlines. Otherwise, we would just piddle around all the time and never get anything finished.
Well, and you just recently asked me to go through some of my poetry, because you thought perhaps you might put something to music, which delighted me to no end. Not that it necessarily is something that might mesh, but you obviously are driven. Pardon?
It will happen. But, you know, I've set poems to music before, and texts, and that's, you know, one of my favorite things, because it allows me to approach a project from a different angle. Like if I'm singing a song, or, you know, a little recital, or in a chorus or whatever, that's wonderful. But, you know, if I'm actually trying to figure out how to set words to a beautiful melody, that's a whole different ballgame. So, you know, I'm just, also, I read a great deal. I love literature. And when I see something that really grabs me, a text or a haiku, or, you know, whatever it is, a little poem, then I become obsessed with it, and until I've actually written a composition. It bugs me, and I can't sleep, and, you know, all those things.
I know one thing, a couple things you've shared with me over the while, that you've sometimes talked about how you thought maybe you go back and study linguistics, and that really you also, you know, could easily study psychology and how you incorporate that in your music. So obviously you're a real true Renaissance man, taking in the philosophies, the arts, you know, encompassing the music and voice and the literature. And you are also a writer. So there seems to be little that you don't take on in that whole creative realm.
You know, it's strange to have you describe me in that sort of way, but I think you've got it all figured out. I don't know what more to say. I do have a wide range of interests, and you know, when I'm teaching in a class, sometimes when I get close to students, they will ask me, well, before we graduate, you know, do you have any advice for us? And I will always say, you know, even though we've focused on music in this class, when you are finding your way through life, you know, do lots of things. I have lots of interests outside of music. And, you know, when I come back to music after I've read a great book, or, you know, I've gone to see a play or whatever, it's constantly changing because I'm viewing it through different lenses. Having, for instance, you know, if I just read a really interesting book, you know, there's some ideas in that book that are going to linger in my mind. And then when I go back to the piano or I compose or I sing, I might have changed a little bit. And then all of a sudden, you know, it could affect how you interpret music, how you write music. Music that I absolutely adored when I was a teenager, I don't care for that much at this point because I've moved on. I've heard a lot more music. Or maybe I feel exactly the same way about it as I did when I was 14.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the fun of it, is you never, you know, you wake up every day and your perception of everything keeps shifting.
Well, and what's interesting too, you know, an education is often considered to take place during a limited number of years. And
Mm.
what you're saying is that you are continually educating yourself. Your days are days full of education, that expansion. And what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is that underneath all of that is that creativity, that passion that is driving that continual feeding of your intellect, of your sensory world, of the passions, looking out onto the birds and seeing them in flight, and the trees and the blooms, and following the thunderstorms, and then all of those things mingling and shifting you, and then the book that you've read, or the score you've just written, or a conversation you've had, and that feeds you.
Exactly. And one of the things that you mentioned, linguistics, you know, that came from, in all the years I sang in choruses, you know, I wound up singing in a number of different languages. And I became fascinated with the little nuances in various languages. For instance, Spanish compared to Italian to French, or, you know, if you want to be more exotic, I had a student once that sang in Estonian. And I was fascinated with that language. Or, you know, I had a student from Finland. And when I was teaching in an international high school for a number of years, I always had coaches from all over the world in my own chorus. One time we sang a piece in Filipino because I had this kid from the Philippines right there. And I found this amazing piece and I said, you're going to have to coach us. I don't know how to pronounce these words. And then, you know, all that kind of stayed with me. And recently, I was looking at an interesting job, and you know, they were interested in the fact that I was a choral director. And I said, kind of in a matter-of-fact way, well, I figured out how many languages my chorus sang in my last job, and I think it was about 18 languages,
Wow.
including Old Slavonic, Swedish. I mean, you know, pretty far out stuff for Americans. And, you know, I just can't get enough of it. So I think it also has to do with my musical ear, because when I was in a conservatory, we had to do all this ear training and sight singing every day. And now, you know, people are kind of annoyed with me sometimes because I'll be having a conversation with them and I'll hear a dog barking 3 blocks away, and I keep losing my concentration because there's some little sound that's bothering me that they can't even hear, you know. Or I mean, sometimes I'm in a restaurant and the background music is, I just can't stand it. And, you know, people kind of look at me because I keep fading in and out of the conversation because I can't tune it out. You know, it's musicians, I guess, and or sometimes even if it's a piece of music I love, you know, I'm seeing a harmonic analysis of the piece while I'm trying to have a conversation with somebody. It's hard to shut that channel off. So analysis is a great thing, but it can also, you know, it can also distract you sometimes to the point where you can't hardly function in anything else.
That's very profound. The world is your music score, and you're constantly having to choose
Mm-hmm.
what you're going to write moment by moment.
Exactly. But one thing I wanted to say is that, you know, one of the reasons I've always devoted so much time to teaching is, and I do a fair amount of coaching singers and vocalists. And what draws me to that kind of work is helping a person build their voice is a really fascinating process to me. And each person is completely different. And, you know, if I teach 5 lessons in one day, it's so invigorating because each person comes in and they're in a totally different place, and their development is, you know, we're in a very different stage than, you know, the last person I worked with. And it's just, I think even beyond the music and beyond the vocal coaching, it's exciting to work with somebody and we see the development and we see things evolving from one lesson to the next. And, you know, the sky's the limit. It's like, how far do you want to go? Well, I mean, I'll tell you something funny. Once in a while, I'll get a call from somebody and they'll say, oh, I want to take piano lessons. And I'll say, well, have you ever had lessons before? And they'll say, no. And, you know, an obvious question is, well, do you have a piano? And sometimes they'll say no. And I'll say, well, first you need to get a piano, right? I mean, that's pretty obvious to me, but not necessarily obvious to everybody. And then, you know, sometimes they'll ask me funny questions like, well, how long will it take me to learn? And I say, I don't know, I've never met you. It depends on how much time you're willing to put into it. I don't say, well, I don't know how intelligent you are. Or, you know, whether you're musically talented, but I'm wondering, if a person says, well, how long is it going to take me to play? You know, I don't know the answer to that question. And they'll say, well, how long did it take you to learn how to play piano? And I'll say, well, I started when I was 4 years old, and actually I'm still learning. And I'm not going to tell you my age, but it's probably I'll never stop learning.
My sense is that there's no word in your vocabulary called retirement.
No, no.
Yeah.
And, when people sometimes ask me, well, how do you view what you're doing? I mean, are you going to at some point stop or retire or whatever? And I say, musicians don't ever retire. We would die the very next day if we decided to retire. I mean, what? I don't even believe in retirement.
Isn't that true of the creative being? I mean,
Yeah.
we are, some metaphysical folks will say that consciousness is creativity.
Mm-hmm.
Creativity is born in consciousness. That right lobe of the brain is where we connect with that creative force. And so that in and of itself is what propels us forward. I wanted to also mention another thing, because for anyone who's looking at this, they're seeing a couple of portraits behind you.
Oh,
so yeah. Your studio, your home is full of art, and very different art in terms of a variety that is unusually diverse. And maybe you could talk just a little bit about your draw to the fine arts as well, the paintings, the prints and sculpture and things like that, because you just to add one more plume in your cap of creativity.
Well, I'm kind of glad you asked me that question, because you might be surprised by what I'm going to say. When I was a child, I used to draw all the time and paint. And then, I had a little bit of art in classes here and there, but not much training to speak of. And my original plan was, I thought I was going to be an artist. And then I, got involved in musical things. And then my youngest brother was very talented artistically. And I saw that when he was a child. My brother Mark, when he was just like 5 or 6 years old, he was doing all of these amazing drawings. So I decided, okay, well, he better be the artist in the family, because he's not a musician. And you know what? I don't think I ever got over the fact that I let that go.
Oh.
So when I go to museums a lot, I go to galleries all the time, I surround myself with beautiful art. I became a collector, not because I ever set out to be, but, I kept finding things that I just had to have. And more often than not, things I couldn't afford. And I somehow always got the money to get the pieces that I really loved. And, so for me, it's no accident that my house looks kind of like a gallery. And my way of alleviating the guilt of not being an artist is to surround myself with beautiful art, or, pieces that really are meaningful to me. And
well, I appreciate it, because I get to enjoy it when I come to study with you. I wanted
thank
to
you
ask
for
you.
asking me that.
Oh, you're welcome. I wanted to ask you, Ron. There were you'd mentioned that music saved your life. I wondered if you could talk to that point.
Well, every day I like almost anybody else, you know, we have periods where we feel a little less certain about things, confident, you know, but I can honestly say that I rarely experience boredom because I have so many choices about what I can fill my day with. And, you know, I also have a whole library of music. So I could just, you know, open a book of Renaissance madrigals and for a couple hours, you know, study them because I love that period. And I'm thinking, you know, I have absolutely no excuse to get lazy and do nothing. And I rarely do that anyway. But I'm just surrounded by all these materials. Or, you know, if I open up a book of Beethoven piano sonatas, you know, and I spend an hour or two looking at one of the ones I really love. It's even though these composers are all long gone, it's like they're sitting right next to you and you're having a conversation when you're studying that music.
How beautiful.
And you know, another thing that I've often told students is that one of the wonderful things about being a performing musician is that every time you sing a song in a concert or you play a Chopin nocturne or whatever on the piano, music is a recreative art in that every time we play a piece, we're breathing new life into it. It's not like a painting in a museum that's been there for 200 years and will never change, except that the paint might darken a little bit. The thing that's so wonderful about music is, you know, suppose I play a Beethoven sonata that thousands of people have recorded or, you know, is being played, you know, somewhere in the world almost every day by somebody else. You're always going to have differences in interpretation of that work. And if I decide to play that composition myself in a recital, in front of an audience, even if I did it 5 days in a row, it's gonna keep evolving. And there will always be something new that I hear in that music. So I feel like musicians live in this wonderful place where we're always recreating the art. You know, it's not static, and it can't be. So, you know, I talk to students about that. I say, you know, how lucky we are that we get to, you know, experience these works of art, but we're also, when we perform them, we're fusing our own personality and our own thoughts with that piece, and it becomes something greater than the two things that are separate. Does that make sense?
It does. And you know, one thing that stands out and has from the first day I came and had a lesson with you is your metaphors. The pictures that you create to describe the music, to describe the composer, to describe the line, to describe the emotional setting of the song. And always they have fluidity to them, and they're, you know, brush strokes or nature settings, and so yes, that does make sense. And you know, I think about when you say that about how music is constantly alive, and as is nature. If you look at nature, it is always in transformation. A tree grows larger, a branch dies. You know, the leaves are larger one year than another, depending upon the rain. And so music is so much a metaphor for nature. And we, because we are of nature, make so much sense. We're so organic, as is music. the organic composition of music is part of the thrill of it. Would you not say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And almost every day I will walk around my property, sometimes several times a day, and I will react to the light changing, and I'll see the little things that the plants are going through, like after a really good rain.
Mm-hmm.
The shade of green changes in the trees, and the leaves perk up a little bit because they've got minerals from the rainwater that you can't give them in any other way. And, you know, those subtle little changes are so fascinating. And, you know, I guess I think about music in the same exact way. Always looking, well, another thing that I've talked to musicians about is sometimes we're very visual in that we're sitting at a piano and, you know, if we're playing in a recital, some musicians see images in their minds while they perform, and others don't. They've never experienced that. They only are thinking about sound. So there was this French piece that I've performed many times, and I kept seeing shades of watercolors in this piece. And finally one day I actually took out some watercolor paints and I painted over the score.
All right.
With washes of color, so that when I was performing it in a concert, I could look at the score. And people were kind of stunned because I, you know, sometimes talk to my audiences, and I think I said once when I was performing that piece, if there are any artists in the audience, you know, I've always seen these transparent shades of color when I play this piece in my mind, and I finally just put the color on the score. And so this artist came up and he looked at the music, and I wasn't painting images, I was just painting washes of color right over the notes. And he was really impressed by that. And he said, well, when did you do this? And I said, you know, I've performed this piece many times and I just kept thinking about color. And I finally, I don't know, one day I thought, well, why not? Let's put some color right on the score. And, you know, he understood where I was coming from. And other people thought, oh, you know, he's finally gone off the edge. And, you know, who cares? I mean, it's like when people say things to you or they make judgments about what you're doing. In the end, you have to just be yourself, right?
Well,
and ignore that.
And yes, as I recall, well, not recall, understand that sometimes you wake up in the middle of the night singing country music.
Oh, well, that's, I don't know what to say to that. In all the years,
you have students who have been singing country. That was my understanding, is how that came about.
In all the years that I've been a musician, I have to say that until recently, country music was probably the only kind of music I couldn't really figure out how to connect with. But then I started looking at some of the lyrics, and that's what drew me to it. And so now, as you know, we've done some country songs in lessons. And I'm really excited in that now all of a sudden this world has opened to me a little bit. I'm starting to be more receptive to it. And there are a couple songs that I have been thinking about quite a lot, country songs, and I'm looking at the contours of the melody and the way the text is set. And I'm thinking, boy, you know, the last thing I ever thought would happen was that I would start, looking at country music in a more serious way, and analyzing it and thinking about it.
Well,
And the
when
other
you
thing
got
about
in,
country, the
go
other thing
ahead.
about country singers, sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt
go
you,
ahead.
is that they're largely untrained. They just sing with the voices that they have. And I've become quite fascinated in how distinct their voices are and the way they phrase and the way they color, their interpretations. And, I'm not saying training is a bad thing, but there are many really gifted singers that have never had a voice lesson, So I'm sorry, I
No,
think you
no,
were about to ask me something.
no. I'm sorry I interrupted you. I'm glad you went on. Well, when you brought the movie Pavarotti to the local theater in Vegas, and of course he was under tremendous pressure when he crossed over into rock and roll, and as a traditional opera singer, I mean, that was unheard of, and yet his own recognition of the inspiration and the beauty and the people who were moved by their music somehow obviously drew him in. So I know we've had some of those conversations about that around your own being brought into the country realm.
Mm-hmm. But, it's so good that you brought this up because, this was a documentary that was made by Ron Howard. And, I never knew that he's very interested in opera. And so he was kind of looking at Pavarotti's life, several years after he had died, and decided to make a documentary. And then, here's this larger than life figure, famous opera singer known all over the world. And then all of a sudden he goes down a different road because he's done it all, except that he's now looking for ways to connect with singers that are not classically trained. They're not opera singers, they're country singers, they're pop singers. And, he starts doing concerts with them. And one of the reasons I wanted to bring this movie to Vegas is because I thought, there's a lot of people here that would love to see this movie because it was about a wonderful life. It wasn't about an opera singer. And it was about this guy who was willing to just follow his own star. And, when he was all of a sudden, I mean, people in the opera world were totally confused when he started doing stuff like this.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of stopped singing opera for a while. He was doing concerts with Sting and Madonna, and I mean, I think Loretta Lynn, I mean, who would have ever thought? And he just adored these people, and I think he'd gotten to a point in his life where he was just I think life became more important than anything else. And being willing to jump into completely new arenas and, interact with interesting people in new ways. And then all of a sudden, his audience base expanded tremendously because all these young people got interested in him.
Yeah.
And, how many young kids do you know that would say, oh, I'm really interested in opera singers? How many kids could you find that would say something like that? But if you mention Pavarotti, he was just universally known and loved. And I think it was because life for him was an adventure every single day. Nobody knew what that guy was going to do.
Yeah.
And, he had various relationships. You know, he left his wife after many years of marriage and then had, you know, affairs with a couple of other women. And in the film, they all talk about him in a very affectionate way. They were, I think they were all just thrilled that he allowed them to be part of his life.
Yeah.
And for all of his shortcomings, and, you know, even though there were hard times that they all went through, I think they all saw that in the end, you know, he was a wonderful person, very generous person. And I guess, you know, just like what I was talking about before, he had a lot of interests outside of music.
Mm-hmm. He was a man who was so passionate, and you could see in just how he embraced people. I mean, he, as you say, life became more important. Life was music. People were music. People were life to him.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to fast forward to today. So today is the 8th of July, 2020. And all around the globe, we've experienced a tremendous upheaval in how we are used to spending our time. Our freedoms have been curtailed. We have been told we must wear masks, even though those mandates are unconstitutional, and there are people who understand that and aren't wearing them. We're told we must stay a certain amount of distance apart from other people. We're being told that the very things that make us smile and give us joy are being taken from us. Gathering and going to the opera and going to all kinds of performances, music or plays, or just being able to be among other people. I mean, when you create that image of Pavarotti, it's throngs of people around him. It's his smile, it's his joy, it's emanating, it's his energy that the people that he allowed into his life got to experience, and back and forth and back and forth. Today, we are being told that we cannot do that we must curtail that. And I'd like to ask you how, over the last number of months, you have maintained your connection to yourself, to your music, to your joy, and how you are walking this period of time. Because there are many people who are wondering how to do this. People who don't necessarily have as many connections to their creative ways. And maybe you could kind of lay out what you've experienced and what you experience, and perhaps even from a perspective of as a psychologist, as a teacher, as an advisor, how people can not just manage, but flourish as you are during these times.
Well, there are moments where I'm feeling quite sad and troubled, as is everyone, I'm sure. And how do we get through these things? You know, that's a very good question. I'm so glad you asked it. One thing that people might not realize is that the fine arts have been hit very hard, because, you know, we thrive on, you know, live performances, big audiences, you know, these wonderful experiences where there's all this energy going on between the performer and the audiences, and we're not allowed to do that right now, and we don't know when that's going to resume. And some people are saying, if ever. No, I can't go down that road. I have to have faith that we are going to get back to that point. So, you know, whether it's being able to walk into a museum, go to a concert, go to a sports event, something like that. This has been a terrible interruption in our lives, and something that we took for granted for so many years, that we could just go off and do these things whenever we wanted to. There's a pause right now, and it's causing me a lot of concern, sometimes stress. And I guess in my mind, I'm really impressed with all the musicians that have been performing online with, trying to maintain a connection however they can and to help people through this. For instance, Yo-Yo Ma, was just playing on his cello, and once in a while we'll post something on Facebook or wherever to give people, what's the word I'm looking for? Relief. He's just opening his heart and he's just putting it out there, and he's playing, and for whoever hears it, it's a gift. And I'm thinking, there's a lot of musicians right now that are trying as hard as they can to post things online. Ensembles are trying to rehearse on Zoom. Boy, that's tough, how to get everything in sync or come up with some semblance of a choral piece where everybody's basically in a different place in a different room. And the amount of editing that needs to be done to make that sound really good. But underneath all of that technology and all of that finagling, then the real message that musicians are sending is we're not willing to let go. You can put any obstacle in front of us right now, and we're gonna do it however we have to do it, and it almost makes me tear up, because that kind of dedication and that sort of determination is inspiring, and whenever somebody says, oh, I don't know if things are ever going to be the same as the way they were, well, probably not. But it sure as heck is going to make us appreciate a lot more if we can get back to those experiences. The next time I'm in a concert, listening to an orchestra or an ensemble or a singer or whatever, I think for the rest of my life, I'm never going to forget, wow, we went through a period where that was just taken away, and musicians and artists, this is not the first pandemic the world has gone through. You think of the plagues and, the 15 and 1600s, and then the 1918, what was it? I forget. The pandemic. Yeah, and the world went on. Yes, a lot of people died, and as sad as that is, it's it doesn't mean the world is ending now. And so there was one other thing you mentioned. I think you were talking about masks and all of the things that are happening right now. My personal view is that we have to be respectful of each other. If someone is, intent on doing social distancing and wearing a mask, we have to respect that. Whether we do it or how far we're willing to go is something, we have to decide for ourselves. I do think that, the issues behind all this are as fascinating as the pandemic itself. Like, what does this really mean? And, you know, the way we're reacting to these things is quite fascinating. It's certainly difficult at times and very sad. You know, for instance, when you hear someone talking about the loss of a loved one during this period of time that got very ill and, you know, wasn't able to be saved. You know, I can't say I know what that feels like because no one that close to me has died. But every day I just think about, well, just observing how people are managing, how they're getting through this, how they're looking after their children. So that's a huge issue. How do you talk to your kids about something like this? I mean, I'm not a parent, but as a teacher, I've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kids that I wound up parenting a little bit in some way. You know, what do you say to them? I mean, how do you deal with their anxieties? So you and I have talked about this a little bit, you know. And when I have a little, you know, a 5 or 6 year old child that comes into my piano studio, right now I'm talking to them for a few minutes before we get to the keyboard. And I'm just saying, well, you know, how's your family? And, you know, you think you're going to be in school in September? You know, and if you're not, how do you feel about that? And, you know, kids are really amazing in that they're resilient. And I think that they're really happy to be asked those questions. And, you know, I also talk to them pretty directly the way I would talk to an adult. You know, I don't think, oh, you know, these aren't the kinds of things that you should talk to kids about. We should protect them and we should shield them from all this. I don't believe in that. I think that they have to really talk about their perception of all this. You know? And sometimes, like I have percussion instruments in my studio, and I'll say, well, do you want to play the marimba today first, or do you want to go straight to the piano? You know, my environment in a way is an escape for them because they know when they come here, there's all these fun things that we can do. And, you know, if they don't feel like talking about any of that other stuff, they don't have to. Sometimes a kid will say, you know, well, I'm really upset. When they come in, I can see that they're in a bad mood for some reason. And, you know, maybe I'll make faces at them and, you know, then they'll kind of laugh and then we sort of break through this, whatever difficulty they're going through. And then we go and do some fun things, you know, and is that psychology? Absolutely. Was I trained to be a psychologist? Never. But you talk to anybody that's been a teacher for any length of time, and they will tell you you're using psychology all the time. You know, it's a way to interact with other people. And, you know, sometimes, one time I was teaching a young woman who was having a lot of trouble with her parents, and she was, you know, in college and she would go home during the summer, and I think that she was at that point where she wasn't connecting very well with her family anymore. And I taught her for a couple of years, and then she went off. She got married and she went to Kentucky, I think. And she sent me a little letter. And she said, you know what? She said, even though I'm never going to be a musician, and, you know, I studied piano because it was just a way of escaping from all the other things I was trying to get through. And she said, sometimes I would go to my piano lesson at your house and I would be feeling so angry, upset, depressed. And I always felt leaving like I was on top of the world. And I thought, wow, that is, for all the difficulties that you face as a teacher, once in a while you get a little message from somebody like that, sometimes years after you taught them, and they will tell you that you gave them something like that. You gave them a little escape hatch.
But isn't it true also, Ron, that not only did you give them an escape hatch, but you taught them that within themselves, they intrinsically own, they intrinsically embody that creative capacity, that tether that they can go to at any point in time, and they can connect with their core being. They can bring that joy, they can bring that passion up, they can alter themselves. So while you gave them the tools and showed them the way from step 1 to step 15, then they finally, ultimately, as she did, left having incorporated that into her life, becoming aware of how to do that empowerment, that self-empowerment through that creative process, her own passionate creative tethering that she has today. And that is a tremendous gift and capacity that anyone who is involved in any kind of creative endeavor. And today, it's really our life and our soul. And I remember that part in Pavarotti where he went to Beijing for the very first time to sing Western opera, because under Mao, all the Western music, all of the culture had been totally stripped from China. And during that whole occupation, 100 million Chinese people were murdered under Mao. So here we have this absolutely phenomenal musician, this artist, this man who embraces life, come and infuse the Chinese people with his passion and magic of music. And so today, we see how it's being, the opportunities for us to gather are being diminished, but there are, as you say, online, and then you're teaching and you share the benefits with me, that empowerment and that development of more voice. So it's truly something that is a lifeline and well beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, when Pavarotti went to China, here's this big guy, that has this radiant smile, and, if it wasn't the first time they ever had heard opera, they certainly didn't have much experience with the Western operatic music. And, they were just entranced. It was something that, they just were very excited about. But it was a combination of things. I think it was his personality, his warmth. He certainly couldn't speak any of the Chinese, languages. I doubt. And but he just stood there, and they were getting some kind of amazing energy from this guy, and probably giving him some too, So, he was a real international artist.
Yeah.
Didn't matter where he was just himself. And, he was very generous. People just absorbed that. It was really nice.
We're going to end shortly, and I wanted to ask you how you define music. And I know you had one story you shared with me once of a student who expressed what music was to them, but maybe just, what is music for you? How would you define music?
Well, you know, you're asking me to do something which, you know, whenever I've had a new batch of kids in a class, I've always asked them that question on the very first day. Like, I want everybody to take 5 minutes and write a short definition of music. What is music to you? You know, and you know, I never thought to write one of my own, but I've read hundreds, and people were so intrigued by that exercise. And uh, you know, as a composer, I guess I might approach it a little bit differently in that I'm always collecting interesting sounds in my mind, fragments of melodies that other people have written that have something special about them. To me, it's a language, and but it's so much more than that. It's, I don't know, from the point of physics, you know, there are physiological changes that happen when you hear sounds. And I'm talking about a broad spectrum of sounds, you know, birds singing, the sound of the wind going through leaves in the trees. I mean, you know, to a composer, those are all things that wind up in our brain and might wind up in a music score someday, might come back out transformed in some way. But it's, you know, whenever I've asked a class that question, we've written a lot of the definitions that they came up with on a whiteboard. And we look at each one and we talk about what we agree and disagree with. And one student said to me once, you know, no one has ever asked me anything like this. This is a really difficult assignment. And I said, yeah, I never said it was going to be easy. But, you know, we look at all the definitions, and there was one student that said, I think she was from, I think it was the Czech Republic. And she said in her very first line, music can never be defined. And then she went on to try to define it anyway. She's very poetic. And she said exactly what I just said a minute ago. Music is the wind going through the trees. It's, you know, the sound of a brook going through the woods. And I'm thinking, wow, you know, this is great stuff. And for her, you know, she was including nature, all the natural sounds in nature, in her definition of music. And then, you know, one of the things I would end a class with it is I'd say, okay, so how many people here listen to music every day? And almost everybody raises their hand, including me. And then I say, well, what if it was taken away from you? What would life be without music? And as I said to you once in a lesson, you know, there's this panic that you see on people's faces, and they say, oh, I would die. You know, I couldn't possibly live one day without music. And, you know, I had a student from Vietnam who told me that in Vietnamese culture, music and art were actually taken away. They were not offered in schools. People were not allowed to play musical instruments for long periods of time in that country's history. The government thought it was a threat. They didn't like the fact that it evoked so many different feelings in people. And she was a wonderful singer. And I said, well, you're not in Vietnam now. So, you know, do as much music as you want to do while you're here. And we had a great time. And she went off to college. You know, she's doing really well now. But that's a great question. And I think I can't even say at this point how I would define it. But it's something that I certainly couldn't live without. You know, every single day, it's part of my day in some way.
Mhm. Well, any last thing that you'd like to say in summary?
I'd kind of like to end with, you know, picking up on this idea of what people are going through right now. I've been kind of toying with the idea of, well, you know, maybe I should do something recorded that I could offer to people to give them some sort of relief or keep them calm. And I haven't yet decided exactly what that's going to be, but I'm writing a string quartet. And I think that I'm starting to put some of those feelings into that piece. Like, what could I do that would keep, you know, give people a sense of calm? You know, what sounds could I come up with that would be soothing, that would be helpful in a period of great stress and uncertainty, you know? So we'll see what I come up with. Maybe a couple of months from now, I'll be able to play some of it for you.
Sounds wonderful.
It's still in my head. I haven't written it down yet.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank you for just a phenomenally inspiring interview, and for all of what you bring to everyone whose lives you touch. It's
Thank you so much. And you know what's really funny is early on today, I kept thinking, well, what are we going to talk about? You know, and then, you know, you look at what happens afterwards. It's so funny.
Well,
anyway, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
And I'll see you soon.
All right.